Excellent. Welcome, everybody. This is Talking Trees. It's a weekly broadcast on Wednesday, and we're here to talk about nature and music and the intersection between those two things. And today I'm very excited. I've got an old friend of mine, Adrian. He spent a long time in Japan learning the shakuhachi, the Japanese flute. We're going to hear all about that in a minute. Talking Trees is part of the Trees of Music project. Trees of Music project, we're planting 50,000 Pernambuco trees. Those are the trees used to make violin bows, which are extremely endangered in Brazil. And that's just the first part of the project. 50,000 Pernambuco trees on the coast in the Atlantic forest. And then further up the coast, we're looking at agroforestry systems made up of various different instruments or trees that you make instruments out of. If you would like to hear more, then go check out rainumbrella.org. That's the website. You can get on the mailing list there and find out what we're doing. We've got a whole lot of performances coming up, and we're going to have more interviews like this. Or you can also go and check out treesofmusic.org. Thank you very much. Adrian, how's it going?
Hi, Danny. It's going well, yeah. I'm traveling at the moment, and I just literally arrived here after a 2-hour drive through a beautiful national park. So I'm feeling a sort of a combination of slightly rushed, having rushed to get here, but also peaceful because I've been in the most beautiful natural environment for the last 2 hours.
Where are you?
I'm in northern Portugal.
Lovely. Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about your flute, about the shakuhachi, and tell me about your introduction to it?
Yeah, I will do. I'll show you the instrument first. This is what a shakuhachi looks like for anyone who's... How does the camera work on this thing?
Yeah, like that. I'm going to try and make it bigger. Oh, no.
So it has a notch in the end, which is basically simply cut in the end to blow over. And it has 4 holes on the front and 1 hole at the back. And it looks very, very simple, and it is one of the most ancient instruments because this instrument in this form has been played like this since, well, for over 1,500 years, maybe close to 2,000 years. And although it's a very simple instrument, it's very, very difficult to play because you don't just play simple sounds. There's a whole repertoire and a whole range of sounds that you learn to play on the flute. I'll give you a quick toot. So that's a very kind of lyrical and sweet sound, which is associated with this instrument. But also you may have heard it on soundtracks for films with a Japanese flavor where the shakuhachi is used like this. These are much more expressive, kind of asymmetrical phrases that use a Japanese scale. So that's my instrument. I'm traveling, and I always travel with the shakuhachi. This one, I don't know if you can actually fit in the screen. This is a very long one, and the long ones have a much deeper tone. And the shakuhachi is associated, I suppose, with 2 things. It's associated in Japan with this kind of very sweet music, which is very evocative of peaceful mood and images of nature, cherry blossom, mountains, clouds, lakes. And the other side of the shakuhachi, which is also strongly associated with it, is this very austere way of playing in the context of Zen meditation, because this instrument was used by a particular school of Zen monks for hundreds of years as the basis for all their meditation practice. And so there's a repertoire of pieces which has been passed on from master to student for hundreds of years within this Zen tradition. And so that music is more like the second kind of little phrase I just played you with some. It has a lot of rough sounds together with smooth sounds and angular sounds, and it has a lot of unexpected elements and a lot of very difficult techniques for fingering and breathing. So that's the shakuhachi in a nutshell. It has these two worlds, and it has this very simple form, which is very ancient, and at the same time, it has this quite sophisticated manner of playing and studying the instrument.
And where did you first encounter the instrument?
Well, I was always a musician. Ever since I was a kid, I started with the piano and the violin, and then I fell in love with the trumpet. And so I was just always learning instruments and always fascinated by new sounds. And when I was in my 20s, I found myself in London, part of the London music scene. I was doing postgraduate music studies, and I was playing all kinds of music. I was playing jazz, improvised music, classical music, Baroque music, folk music, you name it. I was thirsty for it. And within that sort of pool of London musicians, I met a guy called Clive Bell, who at that time was one of the very few non-Japanese shakuhachi players. And he wasn't playing the instrument in a traditional Japanese way. He was using it in a very avant-garde, experimental way. And I heard him play as part of a group in a performance that I was part of. And I went up to him afterwards and I said, I asked him about it and asked him if he'd teach me. And so he did. To cut a long story short, I started lessons very soon after that. And I suppose that was about 35 years ago. And the instrument rapidly became the instrument that I was really devoted to. And it's accompanied me on my journey ever since, including 8 years living in Japan, completely immersed in that tradition. And then many years traveling the world and doing all kinds of collaborative projects with musicians where I play the shakuhachi as a traditional instrument, and also with musicians from all kinds of other cultures in innovative ways, or just in a very simple meditative way.
Thank you. Can you tell us a little bit about the connection between the instrument and nature, and perhaps you can tell a little bit about the story of where it comes from, why people blow down bits of bamboo.
Well, these kinds of flutes that have a simple mouthpiece like this, they're called notch flutes, and they're found all over the world. They're found in Africa, they're found in South America. It's one of the earliest instruments because I guess our ancestors would have noticed that in the same way when you blow over a bottle and you get the whoo, whoo, whoo sound, in nature there are certain situations where the wind blows over the top of reeds or pieces of bamboo that have broken off, and you get a sound. And so from that, it's a simple sort of step to say, well, maybe I can fashion this into an instrument and just sort of refine it a little bit, make some holes to make different notes, and work a bit on the mouthpiece. And so in that sense, it is a very ancient instrument, but the shakuhachi differs from other notch flutes because it has this lacquer applied in the inside of the bore, which you can't see obviously, but if you were to peer down it, you'd see it's sort of black and shiny inside. And the lacquer has the effect of refining the way that the air passes through the flute. And so a lot more tones and a lot more colors and a lot more notes can be achieved in that way. And so the shakuhachi comes from this universal tradition of simply blowing over pieces of bamboo or reeds. And in the hands of Japanese craftsmen, it became this very refined instrument that plays very refined music. And in terms of the connection with nature, and there's quite a few different ways of approaching that question, I suppose. One is that Japanese art, Japanese music, and Japanese philosophy and spiritual practice is full of images of nature, because the images of nature are seen to be symbolic or metaphorical for states of consciousness or different aspects of the human life cycle. And so, for example, the cherry blossom, which is all over Japan in springtime, is the archetypal image of impermanence, because it's so beautiful and it comes, and no sooner has it's come than it's gone. And so the combination of something that you feel this kind of longing for because it's come and it's gone, together with the deep appreciation of beauty, that's a very Japanese sensibility. And it's associated with many aspects of nature, whether it's different birds, animals, seasons, aspects of the elements. And the shakuhachi evokes this in a lot of the music. Pieces have names like the breaking of the waves, or crossing the mountain, or the call of the deer, or the heart moon. And so these kind of images are replete within the tradition. What I can say about that also that's interesting is I did a lot of work in schools as a musician, going into schools with all kinds of instruments and inspiring the kids to make music. And I used to do this thing with them where I'd play my shakuhachi first off, before anything else, after being introduced by the teacher. I'd be facing a class of kids. And I'd say to them, I'm going to play you a piece of music now. I want you to close your eyes. And when I've finished playing, I want you to write down whatever images or words or feelings came to mind when I played. And it's quite astonishing. I did that workshop many times over the years in different places with different kids of different ages. And there's like a family of images that form like a kind of series of themes that just come up over and over again, like mountains and dawn. And you get this from kids who might never have even thought about these kinds of things before, but the music just inspired these very peaceful and a very kind of naturalistic images. So there's that very sort of resonant connection between the instrument and the music it plays. And then the other way of talking about that connection between the shakuhachi and nature would be to do with the material itself, the bamboo. The shakuhachi actually means 1.8 shaku. A shaku is an ancient Japanese measurement, and it's about 28 centimeters in modern measurements. But one shaku would be called ishaku, and hachi is the number 8 in Japan. So shakuhachi, actually the literal translation means 1.8 shaku, and that's this instrument. This is actually a shakuhachi. This length of this instrument is 1.8 shaku. Now, you'll see that it has here these roots at the end. Now, they look very beautiful, but what actually these are these would have been growing like this in the ground, because the bamboo is a rhizome, and where you see the bamboo sticking up upon the earth is connected underneath the ground with all the other bamboo stalks in the grove. There's this big kind of network of roots underneath. So when the bamboo is harvested, the roots are cut off with a sharp knife, and then it's refined like this. Now what you see here is you see the first layer of roots here, and then you see the second layer, and then here, more indistinctly, you can see the remainders of the third layer. This is the first node where the bamboo would have been sticking up above ground, and this is the second node, this is the third, and this is the fourth here where the mouthpiece is made. Now, to have a piece of bamboo that's exactly the right thickness and dimension to make the right tone, and is exactly 1.8 shaku from that first set of roots to the fourth node, 7 joints, that's very rare to find in nature. And so when an instrument like that was found, it would be treasured. And the shakuhachis also always have this slight curve on the end, you can see. I'll show you on this one, you can see the same thing. This is part of the aesthetic of the instrument. And this is much more gnarly and rustic in appearance, but it's the same principle of counting these nodes. And so there's this deep relationship between finding something in nature that is a very specific diameter, and then harvesting it and polishing it and refining it and making holes and turning it into an instrument. And the shakuhachi makers nowadays, they make like 99% of the shakuhachis are always made out of bamboo. But a friend of mine, John Kaiser Neptune, who's a very well-known maker in Japan, one of the few non-Japanese makers who's very respected in his own way. He did an experiment with me one time when I was visiting him. He played me, he told me to turn around and not look at what he was doing. And then he played me a little phrase like this. And he played the same phrase on a shakuhachi made of bamboo, one made of wood, one made of ceramic, one made of glass, one made of plastic, one made of metal. You had like 7 flutes that you collected. And it was really hard for me to tell the difference. They all sounded really good. And when I tried to guess which one was the bamboo, I got it wrong. So what that shows is that in terms of the listener, it's possible that there's not that much difference between a piece of bamboo being played in that way and then something that has the identical dimensions and construction but is made of a different material, because the sound actually comes from here. The sound waves are created when the air column hits the edge, and that's actually where the sound comes from, not out of the bell. However, this is where it gets interesting. As a player, you feel something totally different when you're holding a piece of bamboo. You feel the tradition, you feel the ancestral energy, you feel the connection to nature, you feel the weight and the feel and the texture of the material. And that evokes a certain relationship between you and the music, you and the way your breath manifests into sound, or the way your awareness reflects through the breath and through the sound to reach the eardrums of the listener. So there's something very enigmatic about the relationship between the bamboo and the sound, which is perceived and experienced by the player. And I think that is what comes across to the listener.
Very interesting. We interviewed the director of a film called Trees of Music, or The Tree of Music, the Music Tree, sorry, in English, Árvore da Música. And it's about this Pernambuco tree. And he was the film. They're talking to a French guy who's a violinist, and he's describing the difference between playing with Pernambuco wood and playing with carbon fiber. And really, you have to have a very well trained ear in order to hear the difference. But he was just the disgust on this guy's face as he described playing with this dead thing was very, very palpable. I have a question here, which is brought up by I know that in a lot of classical composers, Beethoven famously used to spend a lot of time in the forest. For example, in his Pastoral Concerto, the names of the sections are things like "Pleasant Feeling" when I reach the countryside, for example. And you mentioned that the names of the tunes that are often evocative of nature. Do we know anything about where these pieces of music came from, or what was happening to the people who were making them?
Yeah, it's very fascinating, Danny, because the Zen monks who played the shakuhachi and who came up with these pieces, they were basically studying the teachings of the Buddha. And the teachings of the Buddha are not so much about identification or connection with nature. They're more a sort of a process of self-inquiry and a sort of purification of consciousness to come to the point where you're able to perceive your own self as indistinguishable from the whole. And within that, a lot of the Buddhist teachings go into sort of explorations of the nature of suffering and why it is that human beings live in this sort of fragmented state and how we can reconnect. And so there's a sort of mirror or parallel process there to how we in the contemporary world are attempting to reconnect to nature to save our souls, because it's the sort of schism between humanity and nature that's causing all the terrible problems we're facing. And this was kind of foreseen in a way 2,500 years ago, when these basic questions of self-inquiry into the nature of consciousness or the nature of compassion or these sort of themes that run through Buddhist practice, they were reflected in these pieces. And so the images of nature, they have a symbolic meaning. So one piece, for example, I can illustrate to you is called Daha. And Daha means the breaking of the waves. And the music is quite picturesque. And so the first phrase I'll play for you, you could imagine an image of waves breaking against a cliff because it's very dynamic music. And then the water gradually ebbing away. And so the first phrase sounds like this. So these very dynamic ways of playing the music, they evoke images that could be used to interpret the title. However, the actual meaning of the title is it's more an examination of what happens when you sit down on a meditation cushion, and you may light a candle and light an incense stick and get yourself in a nice peaceful looking pose to the external viewer. But what happens inside, the monkeys and the wild horses and the, you know, all the kind of thoughts and the feelings and sensations and start flying around. And sometimes what you're looking for, a state of peace, is the last thing that's on offer. And so the music represents that. The meditation music of the Honkyoku tradition, which is the shakuhachi tradition, represents all the different states and stages of the meditation journey, rather than simply representing some sort of new age concept of peace and eternal bliss with everything in these very gorgeous, lyrical, spacious musical phrases. There's a lot of dynamic energy in there, which represents the nuts and bolts and the grit of actually being on a path of self-inquiry or spiritual practice in that way.
Very interesting. What would you say about the role of music in recreating that connection to nature?
Well, I suppose it depends what kind of music. I'm in love with acoustic instruments and with the sound of people playing real instruments together and interacting and sharing through deep listening and interacting and expressing with you know, real instruments. And so what I love about acoustic music is that nothing is ever the same twice. If I was to play a phrase for you like this, a very simple phrase, I could play the same thing. I could play it again. But no matter how exactly I try to play it the same each time, it's always going to be a little bit different. And even if it sounds exactly the same, once you look at the waveform under a magnifying glass, you'll see all the differences. And so nature is like that. I'm constantly marveling at the fact that there are no two leaves the same and never have been. There are no cloud formations ever the same. There are no pebbles on the beach. And when I reflect this through my own experience and think every thought, every feeling, every sensation is the first and only time, really. And then I think music for me in that way represents something about the organic, living aspect of nature, which is quite often unavailable to us because we live in a sterile environment or because we're too busy in our mind, or for whatever reason, it's not always easy to feel that deep connection. And for me, music helps to restore that in a very fundamental and subtle way because of the way that the asymmetrical and organic, infinite way that nature expresses herself is also there in the kind of music that I love and the kind of music that I play. There may be another kinds of music that uses electronic loops or sort of samples and things, which has another quality and a different sort of energy. But for me, it's to do with the texture of the instruments, the asymmetry of the breath, and how what we're feeling in each moment is different, and that expresses through the way we play. And nature itself is different in every moment. The play of light upon the landscape it can never be repeated from moment to moment. And every single plant, even every blade of grass, is different. And so that for me is something magical, which inspires awe and gives a sort of courage, really, to believe in beauty, which is so nourishing and so important to embrace. And so music acts as a bridge to these kind of thematic elements of beauty and wonder and inspiration.
But there's something there about diversity as well, which is interesting to reflect on, as we have two English guys, one a Japanese flute master and one messing around in Brazil with reforestation, talking about music. So tell me, we've just got another few minutes. Tell me about some interesting situations you might have found yourself playing shakuhachi. And I've got a final question at the end as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, the shakuhachi is a very interesting instrument because I found that I've traveled in so many different countries with it and played my shakuhachi in so many contexts. And it just seems to always make this direct connection with people. People just really understand and feel the same responses. I've played with indigenous people in the Brazilian rainforest. I've played with corporate businessmen sitting around employed to do a creative music workshop. I've played with kids. I've played with adults. I've played with jazz musicians, classical musicians, in rock bands. And wherever I go with my shakuhachi, people respond. And so when you ask me about the situations where I've played, what comes to mind is this kaleidoscope of different places in which I've spontaneously connected with people. I'll just tell you one, just jumps to mind immediately. I was traveling in Thailand. This is about 20 years ago. And I was in the northeast of Thailand, which is not a very touristy place. Hardly anybody goes there in the kind of tourist sense. I had gone there searching out a particular kind of Thai folk music. And I came out of this train station. I had to wait for a connecting train. And I saw these two Thai teenagers sitting on the roof of the station in a very, very warm evening. It must have been about 11 o'clock at night. It's so warm. Everybody really, really relaxed. There was a night market there. There was a lovely buzz. And these teenage lads were sitting on the roof of the station. And one of them had a guitar. And they were just sitting quietly singing and playing together. It was such a beautiful scene that they would be allowed to do that without being shooed off, and that, you know, just kind of seemed like a soundtrack to everything else that was happening. And I just, without thinking, clambered up there, sat next to them, got my flute out of my bag and started playing with them. And I've had similar experiences with Chinese people on the Trans-Siberian Express. I played music on an auction of prisoners' artwork inside a prison in Warsaw, which is too long a story to tell you how that happened. And I've played on a boat going down the Amazon River with members of the Huniquin tribe who also loved the music of the shakuhachi. So, yeah, it has this universal sort of resonance that people love, and I'm very happy that that's something I can share.
That's very cool, Adrian. Seeing as you bring it up, there's a particular flute from the Nokikwe indigenous nation, actually from all the groups that are called Katakina. And we have a recording of it that we made of a particular song. It's called Nurusai Monote, it's a song about the approaching fires, the genocidal fires that were started about 100 years ago to drive the Nokikwe out of their region. So we recorded that song a little while ago, and recently we got contacted by the Global Steering Group on Impact Investment, and we've got, I think it's 1,600 people in 33 countries, including advisory boards and World Bank and all these cats coming along to this thing. And we're presenting Trees and Music. And the tune that we decided to present is that song from a flute from the Amazon, except we've had it arranged by Misha Malavabadu to have an orchestral accompaniment. And going through the steps now to get it played, hopefully by one of the groups in London. I will tell you more about that. People who want to know more about Trees and Music, please go along to rainumbrella.org. Check out the blog there. Get yourself on the mailing list so you'll hear more about what we're doing. We've got more talks like this coming up. Next week, I'm going to be meeting Dr. Haroldo Lima, who's one of the world's experts on leguminous species and the Pernambuco tree. Adrian, can you just maybe direct people to where they might hear more of the beautiful music?
Yes, I have a website, which is simply my name, adrianfreedman.com. And there's loads of music there. If you click the tab called Listen, there's loads of music you can listen to. And there's also lots of albums in the shop you can check out. And if you go to my YouTube channel, which is called Zen Heart Music, Adrian Freedman, I have lots of music there with beautiful films to accompany the sounds. And then you can find me in all the other usual places. I've got albums on Spotify, Bandcamp, etc., etc.
Excellent. I mean, we haven't talked too much about where we met, but I have to say that it was almost certainly meeting Adrian in Japan that ended up with me in Brazil, and this whole story of from the forest to wherever we are now. So I have to say thank you very much for that, Adrian, and good to see you again.
Yeah, you too, mate.
All right.
Nice. Okay.
Take care. See you later.
Bye-bye. Ciao.
Bye-bye.